I moved cities after my fiancé asked for a break over a new guy. Reddit podcast. Welcome to another episode on Silent Wars. Today, we have a touching and emotional story to share that will make you reflect on the challenges of life and the power of resilience. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, be sure to like this video and subscribe to Silent Wars for more amazing content. We're here to inspire and motivate you every week. The journey of love and betrayal is a challenging one, especially when it involves years of emotional investment and trust. The story revolves around a 34-year-old man who, after having been through significant ups and downs in a complicated relationship with his ex-fiancée Sarah, grapples with the painful emotions of betrayal and the difficulty of moving on. Their relationship began in mid-2022 when they met at work, instantly connecting and quickly falling in love. However, their early happiness was short-lived, as a minor disagreement led to their breakup. Sarah, who was 29 at the time, didn't just end the relationship quietly, but made a spectacle of it, causing a scene in front of their colleagues. The man, heartbroken but determined, chose not to quit his job despite the pain. But the wounds didn't heal easily, and seeing Sarah every day became unbearable. This led him to make a tough decision. He quit his job and moved to a new place, hoping to distance himself from the emotional turmoil. Over the next few months, the two crossed paths occasionally, and despite the lingering feelings of hurt, they began talking again. Sarah expressed regret for her actions, especially for ending the relationship over something so trivial and for causing a public disruption. She sincerely apologized, and the man, touched by her words, agreed to give their relationship another try. By early 2023, they were officially back together, discussing marriage and even planning a future together. Feeling hopeful and optimistic, the man began working extra hours, intending to surprise Sarah with a proposal and a new home. The excitement of starting a new chapter of their lives seemed within reach, but fate had other plans. Out of the blue, Sarah requested a break. The man, shocked and confused, initially hoped it was just a temporary need for space. However, when Sarah refused to explain why, and he noticed her frequently talking about a new guy at work, suspicions began to surface. The man confided in his close friend Emily, who worked in a different department but kept in touch with Sarah's colleagues. Emily revealed that Sarah's coworkers had been encouraging her to take a break, believing that he wasn't treating her well. Worse, they were even trying to link Sarah to this new guy at work, suggesting they'd be a better match. Sarah eventually admitted that she had indeed been seeing someone else, although she denied any physical cheating. However, the man's anger and hurt reached a breaking point. He ended the relationship, telling Sarah that he couldn't continue, no matter how sincere her apologies seemed. He needed closure and didn't want to keep reopening the emotional wounds. Despite the pain, he decided to move to a different city to start fresh, leaving behind everything that had once been familiar. He blocked Sarah everywhere, hoping to finally cut all ties with her and move on with his life. Despite the clean break he made, Sarah didn't let go. She tried to contact him through mutual friends and even stalked him in the new city where he had relocated. But the man remained firm in his decision, refusing to speak with her. Her persistence only added to his pain, but his resolve to protect himself from further hurt kept him from giving in. Sarah, however, continued to insist on closure, feeling that their unresolved issues needed to be addressed. She confronted him during a run in the park, but he walked away, choosing to keep his distance from the woman who had hurt him so deeply. In the end, the man's decision to cut ties with Sarah wasn't born out of anger, but out of a need for self-preservation. He wasn't interested in reopening old wounds, and as much as he still had feelings for her, he knew that continuing to interact would only prevent him from healing. He shared with his friends that it wasn't resentment, but pain that kept him away. His choice was about moving forward, finding closure on his terms, and no longer being emotionally manipulated by Sarah or anyone else. While some of his friends thought he was being harsh, he knew that sometimes the hardest thing to do was to let go, even when the heart still aches. The complexities of family dynamics are often more intricate than they appear on the surface, and for Thomas, a man in his 40s, his recent life upheaval began with a heartbreaking series of events involving his wife, Delilah, and her teenage daughter, Stella. For years, Thomas had been a steady and supportive figure in Stella's life, stepping in as a father figure after her biological father, Miles, abandoned the family. He worked hard to earn Stella's trust, helping her with homework, attending school events, and trying to create a stable home for her. But, as with many teenage years, the dynamics began to shift. At 16, Stella started to distance herself from Thomas. While he expected some rebellious behavior, the signs pointed to something deeper, and Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Everything came to a head one evening when Stella, in a sharp and unprovoked outburst, told Thomas, "Why don't you just disappear? You're not my real dad." The words cut deeply, but it wasn't the first time Stella had expressed frustration with his presence. The tension only grew over the course of the next week. Stella, who had once looked up to him and asked for his help with her first heartbreak, now seemed to be shutting him out at every turn. When he tried to engage her about her grades, she dismissed him with harsh words, rejecting his attempts to help her with her chemistry project. Delilah, Thomas's wife, stayed quiet, offering no support, but instead sidestepping the situation, telling Thomas, "She's just being a teenager." What followed was a shocking and painful realization. During dinner one night, Stella, frustrated by Thomas's concern, exploded with hurtful comments. Thomas, already confused by his wife's passive stance, was left reeling when Delilah, rather than offering comfort, sided with their daughter. She calmly said, "Maybe we'd be better off without you." The words stung and pierced his soul. He realized then that the once warm and loving family he thought he had was no longer intact. That night, he packed his things and left, heading to his friend Ryan's house for a break. As time passed, Thomas received a slew of messages from both Delilah and Stella, but the bitterness and pain from the argument made him hesitant to respond. It wasn't until a week later, when he learned that Stella had been in contact with her biological father, Miles, that things started to make sense. Miles, a man who had long abandoned his family and who had failed to keep promises of support, was suddenly back in Stella's life. After 3 years of absence, Miles reappeared, claiming he wanted to be a better father to Stella. The weight of that revelation crushed Thomas, as he now saw the pattern repeating itself. Miles's manipulative ways had begun to work on Stella, just like they had on Delilah all those years ago. The story grew more complicated when Stella, convinced by Miles's promises, started to consider moving in with him, leaving the family behind. She believed Miles had turned over a new leaf, offering her a chance at a new life in a way that Thomas and Delilah could not. As Stella began to invest her college fund into a new business venture that Miles pitched as a guaranteed success, Thomas saw the same pattern of manipulation he had experienced years ago. Stella's trust in Miles made him feel helpless and betrayed. Despite his efforts to warn her, Stella stood firm, convinced that Miles would be different this time. But Thomas wasn't ready to give up. He reached out to his contacts and did some research, uncovering Miles's history of fraudulent business ventures. Armed with this information, Thomas confronted Stella, showing her the lies and manipulations her biological father had perpetrated. It was only then, after realizing the truth about Miles's scams, that Stella began to see through his facade. The emotional burden she carried, shaped by years of abandonment and false hope, finally began to lift. Stella's decision to cut ties with Miles wasn't easy, but with Thomas's help, she started to rebuild her life, prioritizing her future over the manipulative promises of a father who had long since proven to be unreliable. The family's healing process began slowly, but Stella made the decision to reapply for her advanced placement classes and refocus on her education. Thomas and Delilah, though still navigating the difficult emotional terrain of their relationship, sought counseling to repair the trust that had been fractured. In the end, Thomas learned that sometimes the hardest part of being a family is not only standing by each other during the good times, but also holding each other accountable when toxic influences try to tear the family apart. What began as a story of betrayal and hurt became one of redemption, as Thomas and Stella found their way back to each other, stronger and more united than ever before. This journey wasn't just about confronting the past, but about protecting the future and ensuring that the mistakes of the past wouldn't define them going forward. The complexities of family relationships and trust can often become overwhelming, especially when betrayal and manipulation come into play. For Thomas, the quiet unraveling of his relationship with his wife, Delilah, and her daughter Stella is a poignant reminder of how things can change in a matter of moments. Thomas had been a constant, supportive figure in Stella's life since he married Delilah. He had been a father figure to her after her biological father, Miles, abandoned the family years earlier. However, Thomas's quiet love and support were no match for the manipulative forces that slowly began to take hold of Stella. Thomas had always been there for Stella, providing guidance, helping her through difficult moments, and being present in her life. He had accepted the role of a father in her life, even though he was never able to fully replace her biological father. Stella, at 16, began to distance herself from Thomas, and he chalked it up to the typical teenage rebellion. But when the emotional distance seemed to deepen, Thomas began to notice something was wrong. The situation escalated one night when Stella threw a hurtful remark at him. "Why don't you just disappear? You're not my real dad." This sudden outburst left Thomas reeling, but he tried to shrug it off, hoping it was just a phase. However, the tension continued to build. Stella's behavior became more distant, and Delilah, instead of offering support to Thomas, remained silent, which made things more difficult. Then came the breaking point. A dinner where Stella, frustrated by Thomas's concerns, lashed out again. She asked him to disappear, and Delilah, instead of defending Thomas, calmly agreed. "Maybe we'd be better off without you," she said. It was the words from Delilah that pierced Thomas deeply. For the first time, he realized that the family he thought was stable had broken apart, and he had no place in it anymore. Thomas made the difficult decision to leave. He packed his bags and went to stay with his friend Ryan, leaving behind his home and his family. His phone, however, continued to buzz with messages from Delilah and Stella, but the emotional wound was too deep. As Thomas tried to process everything, he received news that Stella's biological father, Miles, had reappeared after years of absence. This revelation made everything clear. Stella, starved for attention from the father who had abandoned her, was being manipulated again, this time by Miles, who had re-entered her life with promises of financial success and a bright future. Miles, who had abandoned Stella and her mother years ago, was now asking for money, claiming it was for a business venture. Stella, eager to believe in the promises of a father who had never been there for her, was considering giving him her college fund. Thomas, deeply concerned for Stella, tried to warn her, but she dismissed him. Stella was under the belief that Miles had changed and that he was offering her the opportunity she had been longing for: attention, affection, and a sense of belonging. Thomas, realizing that Miles was not only manipulating Stella again, but also repeating the same destructive patterns, began to take action. He investigated the situation and discovered that Miles was running several fraudulent schemes. Armed with evidence of Miles's past, Thomas confronted Stella. At first, Stella refused to believe the truth, but as Thomas showed her the evidence, the facade began to crack. Stella, with the help of Thomas, slowly started to see through Miles's lies and manipulation. In the end, Stella realized that Miles had only ever been out for his own gain. After a painful process of shedding the illusions that Miles had created, she decided to cut ties with him. She returned to her studies and reapplied for her advanced placement classes, focusing on her future rather than the broken promises of her biological father. Thomas and Delilah, although still navigating the difficult terrain of their relationship, began to rebuild trust. They sought therapy to heal the wounds caused by the years of silence and manipulation. The family, though still scarred by the experiences, was now on the road to healing. Thomas learned that sometimes the most difficult part of being a family is not only standing by each other through good times, but also confronting the hard truths and supporting one another when it seems like the family is falling apart. Through it all, Thomas remained steadfast in his love for Stella, recognizing that the true bond of family isn't defined by blood, but by the support, trust, and care you show one another. While the journey was difficult, it was one that ultimately led to healing and growth. The emotional scars were still there, but Thomas was determined to protect his family and make sure that history didn't repeat itself. The journey of healing after betrayal is rarely a straightforward path. It is even more complex when the person who hurt you is someone you once trusted completely. For Thomas, the emotional journey of discovering his wife's affair and his subsequent decision to leave their home is a painful but transformative story. It is a journey that highlights how betrayal can shake the foundation of even the most stable relationships, and how healing often requires not just time, but distance and clarity. Thomas had been married to Delilah for several years and had built a life together. He had become a father figure to her daughter, Stella, after her biological father, Miles, abandoned them. While their family wasn't perfect, Thomas thought they had something solid. But the reality was far from that. As time went on, Thomas noticed subtle changes in Delilah's behavior. She grew more distant, and their once lively conversations turned into awkward silences. It wasn't just that she was emotionally unavailable, something deeper was going on. The cracks in their marriage began to widen, and Thomas felt the shift but couldn't pinpoint the cause. It wasn't until he found out about the affair that the truth finally became clear. Delilah, his wife of many years, had been involved with someone else. The discovery was gut-wrenching, a betrayal that Thomas hadn't seen coming. What made it worse was that Delilah didn't initially come clean. It wasn't until Thomas, after suspecting something was off, discovered the affair through his own investigation. The emotional toll of this realization left him devastated, and he was unsure how to process the hurt. The betrayal wasn't just about the affair itself, it was about the years of trust and emotional investment that had been thrown away. The immediate aftermath was filled with confusion, anger, and sadness. Thomas could no longer bear the idea of staying in the same house, surrounded by memories that had been shattered by Delilah's infidelity. But what really hurt was the fact that Delilah, rather than taking responsibility for her actions, downplayed the situation and seemed more concerned with her own emotional turmoil. Thomas, on the other hand, was left to grapple with the deep sense of betrayal and the loss of the life he thought they had built together. He didn't want to share a space with someone who had betrayed him, and so, after a heart-wrenching conversation, he packed his bags and left. Leaving wasn't easy, but it was a necessary step for Thomas's mental and emotional well-being. He needed space to process everything. He found comfort in staying with a close friend, Ryan, who provided a sanctuary from the emotional chaos of his life. As he stayed in Ryan's guest room, Thomas reflected on what had transpired. He spent days thinking about his marriage, the choices that had been made, and the trust that had been broken. He also thought about his stepdaughter, Stella, who was caught in the middle of it all. She had always been a source of pride for Thomas, and he had done his best to be a father to her, even though she had a strained relationship with her biological father. But as time passed, something unexpected happened. Thomas received a message from Delilah's parents, who reached out to apologize for their daughter's actions. They expressed regret for what had happened and hoped that Thomas would consider talking to Delilah to work things out. While the gesture was kind, Thomas couldn't bring himself to forgive her. Not yet. The pain was still too fresh, and the wound too deep. He needed more time to heal. In the following weeks, things slowly began to quiet down. Delilah stopped trying to contact Thomas, and he started to rebuild his life. He focused on his career, his friends, and his own healing process. It wasn't easy, but Thomas realized that healing doesn't always mean returning to the past, it means moving forward, even if it means leaving some things behind. For him, that meant ending the chapter with Delilah and focusing on himself. This story is a reminder that healing from betrayal takes time, and the process isn't linear. Sometimes, the hardest part is knowing when to walk away from a relationship that has lost its trust. For Thomas, the decision to leave was not just about his wife's affair, it was about reclaiming his peace of mind and prioritizing his emotional health. While the road ahead may still have its challenges, Thomas is determined to move forward and find a sense of peace that he deserves. It's a difficult but powerful reminder that sometimes the best thing we can do for ourselves is to let go of what's holding us back, even if it means walking away from the people we once loved. The journey of navigating family dynamics, especially those involving betrayal and manipulation, can be emotionally exhausting and deeply unsettling. This is especially true when the betrayal comes from someone within the family you trusted the most, someone who was supposed to support and love you unconditionally. For Thomas, the emotional fallout from a family crisis involving his stepdaughter, Stella, and her biological father, Miles, created a chain of events that forced him to reassess his relationships, his role in the family, and what true support really looks like. Thomas had always been a committed and loving father figure to Stella. Despite the challenges in their relationship, especially during her teenage years, he did his best to be there for her. However, things began to unravel when Stella, now 16, started distancing herself. At first, Thomas thought it was typical teenage rebellion, but as time went on, he realized there was more to it than just growing pains. One day, after a particularly heated exchange with Stella, Thomas overheard a conversation that would change everything. Stella told him, in no uncertain terms, that he wasn't her real father and didn't have the right to care about her grades or her future. The words cut deep. Thomas was shocked and hurt by her sudden hostility, especially since he had always tried to support her, despite not being her biological father. But the emotional blow didn't stop there. When Thomas confronted his wife, Delilah, he found himself facing yet another painful reality. Delilah had been siding with Stella during their disagreements. This silence from Delilah, combined with her lack of intervention, left Thomas feeling completely alienated from the family. Delilah's passive stance on the matter only compounded his feelings of isolation. He didn't understand why she wasn't taking a more active role in supporting their family dynamics and stepping in to mediate the situation. Then, things took a darker turn. Thomas discovered that Miles, Stella's estranged biological father, had reappeared in her life and was playing a more significant role in her decisions. Miles, who had been absent for most of Stella's life, now wanted to make amends. However, his version of making things right came with strings attached, and that's when the manipulation began. Miles, as it turned out, had been using his influence over Stella to get her to invest her tuition money into a fake startup he was running. He had targeted her with promises of a quick and easy financial return, convincing her that this was a legitimate opportunity for her to secure her future. The fact that Miles had been out of the picture for years but was now inserting himself into her life and exploiting her trust only added to Thomas's growing sense of betrayal. When Thomas found out about the scam, he was horrified. He knew that he had to step in, not only to protect Stella, but also to ensure that she wasn't being manipulated further. What followed was a series of tense and emotionally charged conversations. Thomas confronted both Delilah and Stella, but it was clear that the damage had already been done. Stella had already become so deeply enmeshed in Miles's manipulation that she could hardly see the situation for what it was. She believed Miles's lies and was convinced that he was the father figure she had always wanted. Despite all of this, Thomas's sense of duty as a father figure didn't waver. He refused to let Stella fall into the same traps that her biological father had laid out for her. As he started gathering evidence of Miles's deceit and manipulation, Thomas realized that his role in Stella's life had become more complicated. He had always wanted to be the supportive father she needed, but now, with Miles's re-entry, he found himself having to fight for that role, something he had never imagined he would have to do. Eventually, Thomas took action, taking the necessary legal steps to expose Miles's fraudulent activities. But the real victory didn't come from seeing Miles face the consequences of his actions. It came from the way Thomas helped Stella break free from the toxic influence of her biological father. He not only saved her from losing her tuition money, but also helped her rebuild her sense of trust in the people who truly cared for her. For Thomas, the true measure of success in this situation was not the defeat of Miles, but the healing of the fractured family relationships. While Thomas's journey was filled with heartbreak and disappointment, it also led him to a deeper understanding of what it means to truly be a father and what it takes to protect those you love, even when they don't fully understand the harm being done to them. It was a painful reminder that family dynamics are never simple, and sometimes the hardest thing to do is protect your loved ones from themselves. But in the end, Thomas's actions helped guide Stella back to safety and offered her the chance to rebuild her future, free from the manipulation of the past. The complexities of family dynamics are often underestimated, especially when it comes to the choices we make for our loved ones. In the case of Sarah and her long-term partner, the painful end to their relationship was not just the result of personal choices, but rather the culmination of years of emotional strain, trust issues, and external influences. For Sarah, the decision to end her relationship was abrupt, but as we learn, it was not made lightly. Her fiancé, Thomas, had worked diligently toward their future, even planning a surprise proposal. Yet, her sudden request for a break left him confused and heartbroken, revealing just how deep the cracks in their relationship had become. Their story began when they met in mid-2022, and quickly, Sarah and Thomas grew close. Despite a few early disagreements, they managed to overcome them and eventually began discussing marriage and building a life together. Thomas, committed to their future, began working long hours to save up for a home they could call their own. But just as things seemed to be going perfectly, Sarah's request for a break came out of nowhere. The timing was shocking to Thomas, especially considering how much effort he had been putting into making their shared future a reality. Sarah's explanation for the breakup, citing that she felt emotionally distant and unsure of her feelings, left Thomas reeling. His suspicions grew stronger as he began noticing subtle changes in Sarah's behavior. She had been talking about a new person at work, someone she seemed to admire, but then she abruptly stopped mentioning him. Thomas, already hurt and confused, turned to his friend Emily for answers. Emily, who also worked with Sarah, informed Thomas that Sarah had become increasingly distant, with some of Sarah's coworkers suggesting she take a break from their relationship. The situation became more complicated when Emily shared that some colleagues were pushing Sarah toward this new guy, believing he might be a better fit for her. As Thomas processed this new information, his mind raced with questions and feelings of betrayal. He realized he had been blindsided by Sarah's actions. She had not only sought a break from their relationship, but had also stopped being upfront with him about the true reason for her change in behavior. Still, despite all the pain and confusion, Thomas tried to have a rational conversation with Sarah, hoping to find some clarity. But when Sarah finally admitted to her feelings for the new guy, the conversation took a heartbreaking turn. Thomas, in his moment of hurt, decided to end the relationship, feeling that this was a betrayal he could not overcome. After the breakup, Thomas did what many people in his situation would do: he moved away. He relocated to a new city to escape the emotional weight of the situation and to begin anew. But his decision to move didn't make the emotional pain any easier to bear. Sarah's persistent attempts to reach out to him, even after the breakup, only added to his confusion. While some of his friends advised him to have closure by speaking with Sarah, Thomas refused. He had already given so much of himself to her, and the idea of reopening those wounds seemed unbearable. Over time, Sarah's behavior grew more desperate. She sought him out in places he frequented, hoping to have a conversation or seek closure. However, Thomas remained firm in his decision to not engage. His refusal wasn't born out of anger, but from a deep understanding that some relationships are better left behind when they become too painful. Thomas's story serves as a reminder of how complicated relationships can become when trust is broken, and how sometimes walking away is the only way to heal. His decision to refuse further contact with Sarah wasn't about revenge or anger, but about self-preservation. He had given his all to the relationship, and now he needed to focus on rebuilding himself. In a world where people often feel pressured to mend broken relationships, Thomas's choice to step away is a powerful statement about the importance of recognizing when a chapter has truly closed. The complexity of family relationships is often underestimated, especially when it comes to navigating the expectations of blended families. In this particular situation, the story of a stepfather, Thomas, and his relationship with his stepdaughter, Stella, brings to light the deep emotional struggles that can arise when trust is broken within a family. The narrative reflects how the dynamics between a father figure and a teenager, especially one caught between her biological father and a stepfather, can evolve dramatically. For Thomas, his relationship with Stella had begun with genuine effort. He tried to be a good stepfather, showing up for her through the small, everyday moments of life, from helping with homework to providing emotional support during difficult times. They had shared years of quiet, meaningful moments together, and he truly believed he was building a bond with her. However, as Stella grew older, particularly around the age of 16, the relationship began to shift. It wasn't unusual for teenagers to distance themselves from parental figures, but Thomas noticed a more pronounced change in Stella's behavior. She started to drift away, becoming less communicative and more resistant to his attempts to connect with her. Things took a turn when Thomas tried to help Stella with her chemistry project, only to be met with an angry rejection. "Stop pretending you care about my grades. You're not my real dad," Stella snapped. This was the first real sign that something deeper was going on. It wasn't just typical teenage rebellion, it felt like something else. Thomas tried to talk to his wife Delilah about the situation, but she brushed it off, telling him that it was just part of being a teenager. Still, the tension continued to build, and it became clear that their once harmonious family dynamic was beginning to fall apart. The situation reached a breaking point when Thomas and Stella had an argument during dinner. Stella was texting at the table, a direct violation of their family rule, and when Thomas gently reminded her of it, she lashed out. "Why don't you just disappear? Nobody asked you to try so hard." Delilah, who had been silent up until that moment, echoed Stella's sentiments, telling Thomas that maybe they would be better off without him. The hurt was profound. It was a crushing moment for Thomas, one that left him questioning his place in the family. In the days that followed, Thomas quietly packed his belongings and left. He stayed with a friend, Ryan, to process what had happened. His decision to leave was not one he took lightly, but the emotional toll of being rejected by both his stepdaughter and his wife became too much to bear. As he spent time away from the family, he had the space to reflect on the situation and the relationship he had with Stella. It was clear that she had been influenced by her biological father, Miles, who had returned to her life after years of absence, bringing with him promises of a better future. Thomas's suspicions were confirmed when he discovered that Miles had been manipulating Stella, encouraging her to invest in his questionable startup venture. The revelation was devastating for Thomas, especially since he had always tried to be a steady presence in Stella's life. It was painful to see her fall for Miles's manipulative tactics, especially after he had abandoned her for so many years. Yet, Thomas knew that the best way to help Stella now was to provide her with the support she needed to see through the lies and manipulation that had clouded her judgment. The final straw came when Stella began to distance herself further from her mother, Delilah, and her stepfather, Thomas. She started making decisions that felt out of alignment with the family values they had tried to instill in her. But as Thomas began to piece together the full picture, he realized that the best thing he could do was to be patient and offer her the guidance she needed, even if it meant stepping back for a while. In the end, Thomas's story is a reminder of how complex family dynamics can be, especially when a child is caught between two father figures. It also speaks to the importance of emotional resilience, understanding, and the painful yet necessary decisions we sometimes must make for the greater good of all involved. Family dynamics can be incredibly complicated, especially when long-held relationships are tested by betrayal and manipulation. In the case of the story of Thomas, his stepdaughter Stella, and his wife Delilah, the cracks that developed within their family were the result of external influences and deep-rooted emotional challenges. The emotional toll that Thomas faced was profound, as he was forced to navigate a family torn between trust and deceit, and ultimately, his ability to stand by his values was tested. Thomas, as a stepfather, always tried to be present for Stella. From helping her with homework to offering emotional support during pivotal moments, he genuinely believed he was building a strong, positive relationship with her. In return, Thomas expected the same love and respect. But as Stella grew older, the relationship began to shift. Her attitude became more distant, especially around the age of 16, which led Thomas to believe it was just normal teenage rebellion. However, as time passed, the distance between them became more pronounced, and Thomas began to suspect that something deeper was at play. The real turning point occurred when Thomas offered to help Stella with her chemistry project, only for her to respond with sharp words, "Stop pretending you care about my grades. You're not my real dad." This statement stung, and Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more than just teenage angst. It felt like a rejection, not just of his help, but of his place in the family. At this point, Thomas tried to address the situation with his wife, Delilah, but her dismissal of his concerns left him feeling unsupported. What followed was a growing rift in their home. The tension between Thomas and Stella continued to escalate until a heated argument during dinner. Stella, ignoring family rules, was texting at the table, and when Thomas reminded her, she snapped at him. "Why don't you just disappear? Nobody asked you to try so hard." Delilah, instead of mediating the situation, sided with Stella, telling Thomas that perhaps they would all be better off without him. The words hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. His place in the family had always been questioned, but now it felt as though it was being openly rejected. In the days that followed, Thomas made the difficult decision to leave. He packed a bag and went to stay with a friend, Ryan. The decision was not one made out of anger, but out of a need to emotionally disconnect from the toxic atmosphere that had developed in the home. The time away gave Thomas space to process what had happened and reflect on the impact of Stella's relationship with her biological father, Miles. Miles had been absent for most of Stella's life, but now, he was back with promises of a better future, pulling her further away from Thomas and Delilah. As the situation unfolded, Thomas learned that Miles had been manipulating Stella, encouraging her to invest in his questionable business ventures. This realization was devastating for Thomas. He had always tried to be there for Stella, but now he was watching her fall into the same destructive pattern of dependence on Miles that had caused so much pain in the past. Despite everything, Thomas understood that Stella needed time and space to see through the lies. It was not easy to watch her struggle, but Thomas knew that in order to truly help her, he had to step back and let her make her own decisions. His role as a stepfather had always been complicated, but this experience underscored the delicate balance of being a parent in a blended family. In the end, this story is a powerful reminder of the complexities that come with blended families. It shows the importance of maintaining healthy boundaries, being emotionally resilient, and understanding when to step back for the sake of healing. While Thomas's relationship with Stella was tested by external forces and his own emotional struggles, it was through his patience and resilience that he was able to see the situation with clarity and continue to be a supportive presence in her life. In any family, the tension between a parent and their child can be intense, but when that conflict is compounded by external pressure and manipulation, the consequences can be catastrophic. The story of Thomas, Delilah, and Stella reveals how family dynamics can be altered irreparably when trust is broken and when manipulation from outside forces begins to take root. Thomas had always been there for his stepdaughter, Stella. As a supportive figure in her life, he tried to be the father figure she needed, but over time, their relationship became strained. He believed his role in the family was well established and secure. However, as Stella entered her teenage years, there was a shift in her behavior that Thomas couldn't explain. At first, he assumed it was typical teenage rebellion, a phase many parents face. But as Stella's behavior grew more distant, Thomas began to feel alienated. The turning point came when Thomas, hoping to reconnect with Stella, offered help with her chemistry project. Instead of the appreciation he had hoped for, Stella snapped at him, telling him, "Stop pretending you care about my grades. You're not my real dad." This harsh rebuke was more than just a rejection of his help. It felt like a rejection of his role in her life entirely. He had tried so hard to gain her trust, to be there for her, and yet, she seemed to push him further away. When Thomas went to Delilah for support, he was met with silence and indifference, which only deepened his feelings of isolation. Things only escalated from there. One night during dinner, Stella defied the family rules by texting at the table. When Thomas tried to remind her of the family custom, she lashed out, saying, "Why don't you just disappear? Nobody asked you to try so hard." Delilah, instead of stepping in to mediate, shockingly sided with Stella. She suggested that perhaps it would be better if Thomas left. These words, coming from his wife, cut deep. It felt as though his place in the family was no longer wanted, and the hurt was unbearable. In response to this emotional turmoil, Thomas made the difficult decision to leave the house. He packed his bags and went to stay with a friend, Ryan, to give himself space and time to reflect on the situation. His absence gave him the clarity he needed to realize that Stella's behavior was not just typical teenage angst, it was influenced by outside forces. Stella had reconnected with her biological father, Miles, a man who had been absent for most of her life. Miles's return brought with it promises of a better future, but his manipulation and control over Stella quickly became apparent. As Stella grew closer to Miles, she began to distance herself from Thomas. Her relationship with him, built on years of trust, was now eroding, and Thomas found himself watching helplessly as she fell deeper into Miles's manipulative grip. Stella began to listen to Miles's promises of financial success, and soon, he convinced her to invest her college savings into one of his so-called surefire business ventures. For Thomas, this was the final straw. He had always tried to be the best stepfather he could, but now, he was watching Stella make the same mistakes her mother had made when she first trusted Miles. While Thomas's heart ached, he knew he had to step back. He needed to let Stella learn the hard truths on her own. But that didn't mean he was ready to give up on her. This painful experience reminded him that sometimes the most difficult thing a parent can do is give their child the space to make their own decisions even when it hurts to watch. In the end, this story is a reminder of the delicate balance between parental love, guidance, and knowing when to let go. Family dynamics are often complex, and when a child makes a drastic decision to distance themselves from one parent, it can create a deep emotional rift that takes years to heal. This is the case for Thomas, Delilah, and their daughter, Stella, whose family life was thrown into turmoil by the return of Stella's biological father, Miles. For Thomas, who had worked hard to establish a relationship with Stella, her sudden shift in behavior left him reeling and questioning his place in the family. The story begins with a sense of pride for Thomas as he recalls the years he spent being a supportive figure in Stella's life. He worked hard to be the best father figure he could, attending her school events, helping with homework, and trying to foster a close relationship. However, as Stella entered her teenage years, Thomas began to notice a shift in her attitude. At first, he attributed it to normal teenage rebellion. But over time, her behavior became more distant, and Thomas found himself pushed further and further away. The breaking point came during a dinner when Thomas noticed that Stella had defied the family rule of no phones at the table. When he gently reminded her, she erupted in anger, telling him to just disappear and that no one had asked him to try so hard. This stung deeply, as it felt like Stella no longer valued his presence in her life. To make matters worse, Delilah, his wife, did not step in to mediate or support him. Instead, she calmly stated that maybe it would be better if he left. This hurtful comment from Delilah made Thomas question everything: his relationship with her, his role in the family, and his future. In response to the growing tension, Thomas made the difficult decision to leave the house. He packed his bags and went to stay with a close friend, Ryan, to clear his mind and reassess his situation. During his time away, Thomas began to reflect on how Stella had become increasingly involved with her biological father, Miles. Miles had been absent for most of Stella's life, but returned with promises of a better future. He manipulated Stella into believing that he was the one who truly cared for her and could offer her the success she deserved. As Stella grew closer to Miles, she began to distance herself from Thomas. She started listening to Miles's promises, convincing herself that his way was the right way. He manipulated her into believing that investing her college savings into one of his sure things would secure her future. For Thomas, this was the last straw. He had worked so hard to build trust and provide for Stella, but now he was watching her fall into the same traps that had hurt her mother in the past. While Thomas knew that he could not continue to stay in the same house with Delilah and Stella under these conditions, he also knew that Stella needed to learn from her own mistakes. He had to step back and allow her to make her own decisions, no matter how painful it was. This experience made him realize that sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is to give their child the space to figure things out on their own. In the end, Thomas's story is a reflection on the challenges of parenting, especially when the dynamics shift unexpectedly. It is a reminder of the delicate balance between being there for a child and knowing when to step back. It also highlights how external forces, like a biological parent, can dramatically affect family relationships, often making it harder for a child to see the truth until they experience the consequences themselves. For Thomas, it was a painful but necessary lesson in family, trust, and love. When you dedicate your life to supporting and nurturing a family, it's hard to imagine a situation where your own loved ones would turn against you. But this is exactly what happened to a man named Brian when his own family made him feel isolated and abandoned. Despite being a devoted husband and father, Brian found himself being pushed out of his own home, his love unreciprocated by his wife and children. Brian, a successful business owner, had always been the anchor of his family. He and his wife, Jessica, had been together for over 20 years, and their life seemed perfect. They had 2 children, a daughter named Emily and a son named Daniel, both of whom Brian was incredibly proud of. He had always put his family first, working hard to provide them with everything they needed and wanted. His home was filled with warmth, laughter, and memories, all of which he thought would last forever. But as time passed, things began to change in ways that Brian couldn't have anticipated. In recent years, Brian had noticed a shift in his wife's behavior. She became distant and less involved in family activities. He chalked it up to stress from work and the responsibilities of raising 2 teenagers. But when he tried to reach out to her, his attempts were met with coldness and indifference. Jessica, once his partner and confidant, now seemed uninterested in their relationship. The more Brian tried to make things right, the more Jessica withdrew. One evening, after a particularly difficult conversation, Brian came home to an empty house. His children were out with friends, and Jessica was nowhere to be found. When he called her phone, she didn't pick up. Concerned, Brian went searching through their home, only to discover that Jessica had been hiding something from him. On her phone, Brian found messages from another man. These messages revealed that Jessica had been having an affair for months. The betrayal hit Brian like a ton of bricks. His entire world, the foundation of his family, had been shattered. Unable to process the shock and pain of the discovery, Brian confronted Jessica. She admitted to the affair but justified it by saying that she was unhappy and needed something more. Brian felt devastated not only by her infidelity, but by the coldness with which she had treated him over the past year. He had tried so hard to make their marriage work. But now, it seemed like all his efforts had been in vain. As the days went on, Brian's emotional pain turned to anger. He couldn't understand how Jessica could betray him in this way. And the worst part was that their children, who had always looked up to him, began to side with their mother. Emily and Daniel were hurt by the divorce, but they placed the blame entirely on Brian. His efforts to maintain the family bond were dismissed, and he was left feeling like a stranger in his own home. The emotional toll of the situation was overwhelming. Brian had spent years building his family, only to have it torn apart by betrayal and rejection. His children, once his pride and joy, now turned their backs on him, believing their mother's version of events. The pain of being abandoned by the very people he loved most was unbearable. He felt like an outsider in his own life, a man who had given everything to his family, only to be discarded when things got tough. Despite everything, Brian knew he had to find a way to heal and move on. He sought therapy to deal with his emotions, and though the road was long, he began to understand that sometimes, no matter how hard you try, relationships can fall apart. He had done his best, but ultimately, he could not control the actions of others. As he worked through his pain, Brian realized that he needed to let go of the anger and resentment that had been consuming him. The betrayal was a deep wound, but he knew that if he held on to it, it would only continue to hurt him. As time passed, Brian began to rebuild his life. Though his relationship with Jessica and the children would never be the same, he found peace in knowing that he had given his all. He learned that sometimes, even the strongest relationships can break down, and that healing comes from within. Despite the deep scars left by the betrayal, Brian understood that moving forward, he could still create a life filled with meaning and purpose. Life, especially in our later years, often teaches us that even the most devoted relationships can unravel when trust is broken. One of the most profound lessons is the importance of self-worth and the strength to move forward, even when those we love deeply fail us. When faced with betrayal or disappointment, it's easy to feel lost, but true healing comes from within. We must remember that our value is not determined by the actions of others, but by our own resilience and the love we give. In these moments of heartache, it's crucial to recognize that healing isn't linear. It takes time, patience, and self-compassion. For those who've spent years nurturing relationships and family bonds, it can be difficult to let go, but sometimes doing so is the only way to restore our peace. Life's journey isn't always about staying in situations that hurt us, but about learning to grow from them and create new opportunities for happiness. Even in the face of adversity, our ability to rebuild and cherish new beginnings can bring unexpected joy. Remember, it's never too late to take care of your emotional well-being and find fulfillment in life again. The most important relationship you'll ever have is the one with yourself. Thank you so much for watching. We hope this story left you with something to think about. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Silent Wars for more incredible videos. We truly appreciate your support.